So I binged 4 different landlord Reddit forums so that you wouldn't have to, but I say that you wouldn't have to, and that assumes that you don't like Reddit. The last 3 to 5 years, I've become like a Reddit super fan. I spend so much time in there, and I think the reason why I do that is because Reddit is an awesome place to go if you want to learn about the lived experience of whatever you're interested in. And so that can be a hobby, or in this case, it's going to be landlording. And we're going to talk about the pros and cons, or not even pros and cons, but what makes a landlord's life easier and what makes a landlord's life harder as landlords are self-reporting on Reddit. And that's how I really like to use Reddit, is to see like, okay, if I'm going to approach something, what are other people that have already had this experience talking about? And a fun fact on this, I heard on a podcast about 6 months ago, the podcast was called Pivot, but they said that Reddit is the 6th most searched Google term because the people searching on Google wanted to know the authentic experience of what was being sent back. So before we get going, if you learn anything on this video or find anything interesting, please like it. Second, I'm Erin Spradlin, so I make a lot of content around what it's like to be a mom and pop landlord. I've been doing that since 2022. I have also written 3 books about the mom and pop landlording experience, which is also why I wanted to look at 4 different Reddit forums that are more current and see if they match my experience. I've been a landlord myself since 2014, but to see if that experience matches up with what I wrote in my books, with what I talk about on my videos, with what I coach on. And so I also coach people nationwide about how to be landlords or how to start landlording. And if you are curious about that, I will talk about it at the end of the video. That way, if you are not curious about that, you don't have to sit through it for this video. Okay, and before we get started, I also wanted to pull this because I fully believe this advice and I fully believe what this Redditor is saying. And that's not to say that if you're a landlord and you have a rogue renter, or you have a tenant experience that goes awry, or you find the tenants difficult to work with, that that's a comment on you. But what I do like about what this comment is pointing out, and which I very much identify with, is that as a landlord, you have a lot more control over the rental than the renter does, or than you might personally think you do. I know a lot of people that are new to landlording are scared of the experience because they think they're going to get awful tenants or the place is going to get trashed, right? But you as the landlord actually have so much power when you think about your vetting practices, who you allow in the property, the way you write your lease. If you're watching these videos, you're probably off to a good start because you're actually doing research, and some of your competition isn't. Some of the people that have had really negative landlording experiences, the reason why they have those negative experiences is because they went in cold, whereas you are doing your research first. So the first lesson that I pulled, the reason why I pulled it is because there's some context needed for this. And I think that the reason why there's context needed for it is that it used to be true and it might be less true now. And that's because we are seeing a change in the renter behavior pattern. And then we're also just seeing a shift culturally. And I'll talk about what it looks like, or the difference between short-term vacation renters and long-term renters. They're both mirroring this trend, but they're probably mirroring the trend for different reasons. And I know that in the past, if I had a rental property, and let's say it was rented through September 30th, if I hit September 1st and I still didn't have someone lined up for that first week of October, so my next tenant or my next renter coming in that first week of October or sometime in October, ideally in that first week of October, it would really freak me out. But now I'm like backing off on that. And what this first lesson is saying is that better tenants, or the best tenants, shop early, and that tenants that won't treat the place as well or aren't as good will show up late. And so I used to think that was true because it is kind of like, how can you not know where you're going to be living for the next 6 months until like 2 weeks before? Or how can you not know that you're taking a vacation? But this narrowing window as far as when people are booking their travel, either for furnished rentals, short-term, long-term, or long-term unfurnished, we are seeing the window get smaller. And there's a couple of reasons for that. We think in the long-term space, the The reason why that window is getting shorter is because of economic uncertainty. When you see all the news headlines and you're freaking out about the tariffs and you're not sure what's coming next, it makes it harder to make a big financial decision or to make the next leap. And so that's why they think that you are seeing long-term renters hesitate a little bit before they make that jump. Something that might also be influencing that is that in certain markets, renters are definitely gaining more power, and that's because sellers can't sell. They can't sell at the price they think they should be getting, and so they're moving into rentals. It's creating an influx of rentals in certain areas, and so then the renter has more power to negotiate the price, or they're looking for deals. And then on the short-term furnished side, which is more vacation behavior, people are deciding to vacation more last minute. So all of a sudden you have a weekend free, or you know, Wednesday through Sunday, I don't have anything going on, so let's take a trip. While this is anecdotal, there might be some patterns you can pull from this with James and myself. James and I work online, so we can work from anywhere. More importantly, we don't have kids. So we are dinks, we're those double income, no kids. And so we have more flexibility with our travel. And the reason why I'm pointing that out is because if you have a property that's a studio, a 1-bedroom, a 2-bedroom, kids are probably not going to show up there, especially if it's close to like city centers. So you actually might see more short-term bookings or more bookings with a narrower booking window because your renter profile might have more flexibility than if you had like a 5-bedroom, 3-bath, which might be the preference more of people with families. So the second lesson, the second Reddit and landlord lesson, I have definitely witnessed in landlord forums outside of Reddit. So you see it in Reddit, but you also see it like on Facebook when people are talking about how to use Furnish Finder, if they're new to Zillow or new, not as much on Airbnb, but like more of the long-term rentals, whether that is furnished or unfurnished. But you see these like kind of thoughtful, well-meaning landlords asking about whether or not they should wait for a tenant to come back. So they've been talking to this tenant and all of a sudden the tenant ghosted, or they just haven't communicated in 3 days, and now someone else is interested, and what should they do, or more disturbing to me is that sometimes you'll see landlords say, and I didn't entertain that because I already have this one person that said they were interested for 3 weeks from now and we had a good connection. Well, you see this all the time where one party thinks you have a good connection, and maybe you do have a good connection, but for whatever reason it doesn't work out. You see that with dating, you see that with job interviews, and you definitely see that with landlords and renters. So my thought has always been that a motivated renter, someone that really wants your place, will be in front of you all the time. They'll be answering your questions, they'll be returning your emails, they will pick up the phone when you call, they will show up when they ask to see the property and you are there with the door open waiting for them. You don't ever need to hunt down a tenant or a renter. If you are trying to get in front of them or they've suddenly disappeared, they're not going to rent your place. And so the best thing to do is to find the next tenant. And this particular piece of advice from this Reddit landlord is to keep talking to other tenants until you get a security deposit. And I think that's great advice. I would say keep talking to other tenants, keep talking to other renters until you have a signed lease and you have a security deposit. Deposits serve all sorts of functions, and it's not just protecting the walls or the floor in your property. It is also to help protect you with the rent. If you've held it and you haven't marketed it because you were counting on someone to be there and they never show up. So it's really important that you take that deposit and that you have a signed lease before you stop conversations with other tenants or renters. Okay, lesson 3 speaks to my heart. If you have watched any of my videos or you listen to our podcast, you know that communication is just a huge thing for me. And I think it's so important with a renter. And the reason why I think it's important is that a renter that isn't freely offering you information, like why they're coming into town, if they're bringing a dog, if they have kids that are joining them, they're not doing some kind of introduction where they're sharing information with you, then you know it's going to be really hard to get information out of them when something's going wrong, or they might they're just not strong communicators. That said, this particular lesson is actually not about the renters, it's about the landlords. And so this Redditor is saying, respond to messages promptly. And what we see sometimes, or what I see sometimes with my consulting clients, is someone will come in and then because they don't have all the information, they hesitate to respond. So they will let it linger. And a best practice is definitely to just say, hey, I received your message. Thanks for your interest. I need to figure out that information, or I'm at dinner right now, or I'll get back to you. So something that's appropriate is to say, hey, thanks for checking me out. I will get back to you this afternoon or tomorrow morning, but I just wanted you to know that I saw your message. That will make the tenant feel good. It will make them feel heard, and it will also let them know that the information they need is being worked on. And both for lesson 2 and for lesson 3, so responding to messages promptly, but also lesson 2, getting the deposit. I think that there's an opportunity here early in the relationship to establish yourself, the landlord, as the authority and give structure to the relationship. 2 to 4 sentences is a good way to go about doing this, but it's like timelines. It's not that the property won't be available to them, but you're saying like within 72 hours, if you can sign the lease or send me your questions. It gives them a framework of what your expectations are. And you shouldn't just assume that the tenant renter knows what they're doing or what the process is. They might be new to renting, like maybe because financially they couldn't ever move out, or maybe they just got married, or maybe they just got divorced and they're back in the renting pool. So give them some structure, whether that is responding promptly and saying, hey, I got your message and I'll follow up this afternoon or tomorrow, or saying to them, thank you so much for your interest. I received your application. The next steps are the lease. That said, if you give someone 72 hours and you're at the 48-hour mark and it's not signed and someone else is coming in, I do think it's fair at that point, because you've given them a time frame, to say someone else has come in. I need to hear from you by this afternoon if you still want it, or it's still available to you, but I'm going to start pursuing other conversations, or I am going to take this conversation. And just for clarity, I wouldn't do that unless you had given them a time frame for signing the lease, which I think you should, because you're in pretty late stages of the application, meaning you've probably exchanged emails, they have filled out the background and credit check, you're just waiting on the final details of the lease. And once you've gotten to that point, it's nice to say, hey, you have 72 hours to finalize this. So some kind of heads up on that. Again, over communication is really what you want in the rental space. And that is both so that the tenant can take comfort in the structure, and also you want a very communicative tenant so that you know, and I was going to say that they'll always be flagging things for you, which doesn't always sound like fun. You don't always want a tenant that's just flagging things for you, but what you do want is a tenant that's going to tell you when there are issues, and you want to make sure that they feel comfortable coming to you and talking about it. But that secondary part is sort of how you set up the relationship. The first part is also a vetting mechanism for tenants to see how they communicate and how they introduce themselves and what information they share with you up front, because a tenant that's stingy on details up front about why they're coming is just going to be stingy, whether that's intentional or not, on details as they move forward. Also worth flagging here for people that are responding, the landlords responding, not just being prompt, but adding nicety. Say something nice to them up front so that it makes them feel warm and that they like you and that they want to rent from you. Lesson number 4 is a great tip from a Reddit landlord. And so this Reddit landlord is recommending that you screen tenants before you go to show them the place. And I think this is good advice because, again, potential renters probably aren't trying to be jerks, but they're trying to secure housing, and they're maybe reaching out to many different people, or they have a lot of stress. And so just because they've said that they're going to meet you at 1 o'clock at the property doesn't mean that they will. And not all people intend on showing the property. Sometimes you will just do a video, especially if there's already tenants in the property. If you do that, then you can maybe share the address, but you need to be careful about that because you don't want an empty property and some stranger knowing the address. So for example, on Zillow, you can hide your address, and for the most part, I recommend doing that. But if you are going to show the property to a potential tenant, then I make them either fill out an application or send me their license. This is to protect the empty property if no one's there, because now you have someone that has come to the property and knows that the property is empty, and then all of a sudden maybe they're not interested. So that's one thing, you have a bit of information on them before you disclose that. The second is that we want tenants to have skin in the game so that they don't just forget to let us know that they're not going to show up. And it wasn't just a casual like, hey, I'm just going to look at 8 properties and I'm going to blow off a few of them. If they have put some effort in, there's a much better chance that they'll show up. Internet Reddit landlord also said text them before you leave, like, hey, are we still on, morning of? And I think that's great advice because, again, there's no reason to interrupt your day or to show up if the person's not going to be there. And so I think between these two practices, so having them send the application or their license and texting them, you should have a pretty good run of actual serious tenants coming to see the property. Okay, so lesson 5 is the first one that I do not agree with, and I'll explain how to protect yourself in lesson 6, because when I say lesson 5, you're going to be like, really? But what this Reddit landlord person is saying is to have them send you recent and consecutive pay stubs. This certainly isn't bad advice, but it puts one more obstacle in front of the tenant. And you actually, to the extent that you can, want to make the process as smooth as you can for a tenant. It's also part of the reason why, like on a long-term Airbnb, we wouldn't put them on a lease or a deposit, in part because it's heavily discouraged, but also because all the other landlord hosts aren't going to be doing that, even if it's a long-term, and that's not really what we want. And so recent and consecutive pay stubs, in some ways, this might be easy enough for them to do, and it is certainly better than just having them self-report what their income is. But the reason why I don't care about that is because of lesson 6. And lesson 6 is that you credit and background check every tenant that comes in. And this is very, very good advice. So we see in this one Reddit thread, someone is saying, you know, I really didn't enjoy my experience. And then they list, like, we didn't do credit and background checks. We didn't know what we were doing. And then in this other Reddit comment, we can see someone saying, you know, I used to work for a rental company or like an apartment complex, and I was the person that decided on which tenants were going to come in, and whoever had a great credit score always paid their rent on time. I would say 90% of my decision comes from the credit score. And I want to say the average credit score in the United States for a renter right now is 638. So you have this threshold of above or below, but that's national. And obviously certain regions are going to have higher credit scores because it's a higher income area, or lower credit scores. You might have a very good tenant that pays their bills all the time, which you can see in the credit score, but they don't have a great score necessarily because they're really high on student debt or something. So I think the best thing to do is to pay attention to how often they pay their bills, and also, just as a general rule, their credit score. I am pretty militant about getting a deposit and making it equal to 1 month's rent, because there's so many things you have to protect yourself with that deposit. But if I was going to have any flexibility on the deposit, it would be for a renter that has a very good credit score. That said, renters that have very good credit scores usually don't ask for a decrease in the deposit because they have the money to cover the deposit. And that's another reason to keep the deposit equal to 1 month's rent, is that it's a vetting mechanism. If a tenant or a renter cannot afford to put down a deposit that is a fully refundable deposit that's equal to 1 month's rent, they might not be able to afford the property. But regardless, before you sign a lease with anyone or take any money from them, get the background and credit check from them. Okay, lesson 7, you can see the exclamation mark. This person feels strongly about it. This is a little controversial because I really do think the credit score tells you everything that you potentially need to know about the tenant, and then you can do a deeper dive, as does their communication. Sometimes when you look up a tenant and you see that they wear their hair a certain way that you don't like, or they have piercings that you don't like, or that they have a job that you assume makes them a responsible person, or they have politics that you agree with, then you might start to discriminate both favorably and unfavorably against or for a tenant when you're really not supposed to be doing that. So I don't love that side of it, but I will say there have been a few occasions, and it's not always true on all platforms, where you'll have access to their last name. But when you can Google them, you probably do want to. I think the best way to have a successful rental is to have these processes that keep problem renters out versus trying to deal with a problem renter once they're in there. That's why I think it's more important to have really strict house rules that the tenant sees before they sign something versus having a lease, because the lease is there to protect you once there's a problem, whereas the house rules might deter a rogue tenant from coming in because they're reacting to the rules and thinking like, oh, this person is paying attention. That said, you have to be careful with that too. It's just like when you introduce yourself, you don't want to overshare, and you also don't want to seem like a really strict landlord because you have 50 rules. And I will say this is definitely something when I am working with consulting clients about getting their first rental set up and how they want to communicate both the listing and themselves. This is something that we spend a little bit of time on because you want to signal to the tenant that you're on top of things, but also that you're not overbearing. Okay, for lesson 8, I like this one a lot. So this Reddit landlord is saying anyone who resides in the unit for more than 2 weeks consecutively must also pass the credit and background check. I think you also could require that they be put on the lease, because you might have a tenant that you've had a great relationship with. They've been in the property for 3 years. They've always treated the property with respect. And then all of a sudden they move a partner in, or they move adult children in, and the property isn't being treated as well. Well, now you have some ability as the landlord to say that person has to leave or this situation has to change, but you flagged it before the person has ever arrived and said they have to meet some criteria. And if they don't, then it's up to you. Like if they don't meet the criteria but everything's going okay, maybe you don't care. But if they don't meet the criteria and everything isn't going away, you have a clause to exercise to get that person out. And so for that reason, I think that this is a very useful thing to have in your lease. All right, lesson 9, this is quick and easy. The Reddit landlord is saying, let the tenant know where the water shutoff is, and also let them know where the electrical shutoff is. I agree with this. I think it's really important, but I also think, and something they're not saying here, something that can help you a lot, whether or not you decide to do a professional marketing video where someone can see the property without actually being in it, I think it's important as the landlord or as just a homeowner to go through and film your property. Film where the water shutoff is, film where the electrical shutoff is, but also film, especially if you're a furnished rental, all the stuff in the property, because if you have an insurance claim, you're not going to remember everything that you lost or that got damaged. And if you have video proof, that's really great proof, and you can pause it and look things up, or you can see the full picture. And so I really like just having videos of my property to know where they stand. But also with this, you could video where the water and the electrical shutoff are, send that to the tenant and have them confirm that they have watched it and that they know where it's at, because way better to have them educated on it before it's a crisis. Lesson 10. So my notes say disagree. I'm not sure that I disagree, but I don't also feel strongly about this. One of my consulting, he lives on site, and he's saying that he's the property manager. He's not disclosing that he's the owner. And I know that this is a trend, but I don't love it, because I think if the renter or the tenant finds out that you are the owner, then you've started your relationship as a lie. I understand why people are doing this. They're doing it because they think that the renter might be more likely to vent to the property manager or tell them concerns in a way that they wouldn't with the owner. But I am big on transparency, and if I rented and then I found out that the landlord lived in the back and he said he was the property manager, I just wouldn't love it. It would just, it introduces an element of a lack of trust that doesn't need to be there. I'm not sure that I understand or I agree that there's some huge value about hiding your identity. If you're worried about disclosing that you're the owner and then something happens and you get into a lawsuit, I don't know how that would be different if it was if they thought you were the property manager instead of the owner. So lessons 11 and 12 both speak to when a renter is about to leave the property. The first lesson that this Reddit landlord is suggesting is that you ask them what they paid for the utilities. Now, if you are doing a furnished long-term rental, you may be paying for the utilities because those are convenience properties. And so when you have a convenience property, it's not just furnished for their convenience. So you may very well know what the utilities are, but if you don't, you might ask the tenant if you have a good relationship with them so that for the next tenant that comes in for the long-term unfurnished, you can say, this is what the last tenant reported and it was 2 adults and 1 child or just a single dude, whatever, and they can get a sense. The final lesson, the 12th lesson, is the most important lesson, and it's something that seasoned landlords understand, but new landlords sometimes have to go through a couple cycles before they get it, and that is that taking a tenant long-term that is paying below market value or a little bit less than you think you can get is way more important than maxing out or covering your mortgage. And I know that covering your mortgage is probably controversial and probably a big turnoff. And this is a hard lesson to learn, but the rental market does not care what your mortgage is. And obviously your mortgage is going to be different depending on when you got it. People that got a mortgage in 2020 are in a better position to rent out than people that got a mortgage in 2025. If you have a tenant in there and they're paying $3,000 a month, if you lose 1 month at $3,000 a month, if that's your mortgage, that's the equivalent of 30 consecutive months at $2,900 a month and you just paying $100 out of pocket. So the main thing that you always want to do with your rentals is to keep them booked. And this is also a good segue into my consulting work and what I do for new landlords, often reluctant landlords, sometimes accidental landlords. If you're not interested in that, this is the time to drop off. But if you are new to landlording, whether you did that on purpose or it just fell into your lap, I work with a lot of people like you that aren't sure what their local laws are. They aren't sure how to protect themselves. They aren't sure about insurance. They aren't sure about bank accounts. They aren't sure about LLCs. They haven't figured out the platforms yet. They don't know where to find the background check. So when people hire me, they are hiring me to pay down that education tax quickly, meaning that you are taxing yourself and you're losing a lot of money as you learn the process of rentals, whereas people that work with me are getting the information fast. They're being put up on the platforms fast. We are matching the lease with the local laws, and we're talking about how to find that. And we are presenting both you, the landlord, and the rental as someone that is appealing to quality tenants. And this service is provided nationwide. I actually run my properties from 1,400 miles away, so I can coach you on how to run them from next door or from afar. If you want more information on that, you can click here and here. Thanks.